So this is your last lesson related to solving quadratics and in context of word problems. So it's important to remember that when we are solving a quadratic, it means that we're finding the value of x for a certain value of y. And in word problems, sometimes it's obvious what the y value is that they're asking you to solve in relation to, and other times you kind of have to pull that information from what's given in the question. So our strategies for dealing with these problems is number one, we need to sub or plug in the given value of y that's in the question. And then our next step is to move everything to one side of the equation so that one side of the equal sign is 0. And then this means we are solving or finding the zeros of the resulting equation. And finding the zeros means that we're using one of our two methods. We have factoring, or we have the quadratic formula. So again, this all comes down to essentially finding the zeros. Even though in the initial question it might not be asking you for the zeros of the given equation, our method is to end up with an equation where we are finding the zeros of it to solve the problem. So here's your first example. The volunteers at a food bank are arranging a concert to raise money. They have to pay a set fee to the musicians plus an additional fee to the concert hall for each person attending the concert. There's the relation which models profit, P in dollars for the concert when N is the number of tickets sold. So we have P for profit and N is the number of tickets sold. Determine the number of tickets they need to sell in order to break even. So there's my keyword. Now before I'm going to go into break even, we're going to do a little sketch here because it's a word problem where we've got profit and number of tickets. So I'm dealing with two quadrants actually. Profit can be negative, so I can go down like this, and then we only have a positive number of tickets. So here's N and P. And that's in standard form, and my y-intercept is here, negative 48,000. So I'll just put that here, negative 48, and I'll put a K for 48,000. And then we're going to have a parabola that opens down, so it's going to come up and come back down. So what are these break-even points? So remember, profit is the money that we make after we've covered our expenses. So if we're in the positive profits, that means we're making money. If we're in the red down here, that means we're still covering our expenses and we're in the hole, we're not making any money. And then there's those break-even points, which are right here, and that's where our profits are 0. So we've sold enough product to cover our costs, and now you can start making profit. So they're selling tickets, and they've had to pay for this concert hall. So we want to find the number of tickets they have to sell in order to cover their expenses. So break even is that y value that I'm talking about that we have to sort of get from the question, because it hasn't given me a value for profit other than in this word break even. So the key here is that my profit is 0, and that's where I'm going to start. So negative n squared. So right there, it's asking me to find the zeros of that parabola, and my methods are either factoring or quadratic formula. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to factor out that negative. Always factor out a negative. Not that you have to, but it allows us to simplify the equation even more. And so now I have to factor this. Now 48,000 is a big number, and maybe if my number sense isn't that great, I don't want to sit here for a long time trying to figure out two numbers that multiply to give 48,000 and add to 580. Now this is pretty straightforward because I know that 480 times 100 is going to give me the 48,000, and also the 480 and 100 would make 580. So this is an easily factorable one, but let's say you were looking at those numbers and you're like, too big for me, I'd rather just go to quadratic formula. That's fine. So I'm going to use the quadratic formula here. Remember, the quadratic formula usually starts with x equals because we're finding the x-intercepts, but in context of this problem, it's actually n equals. So I'll put that. And then I'm going to start with the formula. Always start with the formula first, and then we will plug in. So negative b is negative of negative 580, so that's going to be positive. And then we have b squared minus 4 times a times c, all over 2 times a, which is 1. Okay, remember to go to the side if you're prone to making slip-ups. Maybe good to list those out. So we have 580 plus or minus, and remember, we're going to do all of this inside the bracket at one time. So 580 squared minus 4 times 48,000 is the square root of 144,400 all over 2. So there's n. And from here, I'm not going to bother rounding that square root. I'm going to find out what one of my first x-intercepts is by doing 580 plus 144,400 over 2. And the other one is going to be minus. So 580 plus the square root of that divided by 2 is 480. And so there's one of my x-intercepts, and this one is going to be 100. And if I go to my graph, that would be 100, and that would be 480. So those two answers are applicable here. This is the number of tickets, so therefore they need to sell 480 or 100 tickets to break even. And I could have come up with this by factoring. So if I went back to this step, I know that two numbers that multiply to give 48,000 is 480, sorry, and 100. And then if I make them both negative, negative 480 plus negative 100 is negative 580, and that's positive 48,000. And so from here, I would be solving where this is equal to 0 or that is equal to 0. So I'm going to get n is equal to 100 or n is equal to 480. So both are acceptable, but like I said, oftentimes if it is factorable, your teacher might ask you to always do factoring first if possible, then to move to quadratic formula. But we can see that we'll get the same answers from both methods.